Welcome to Planting for Birds, presented by Mathew McDowell, who is the garden director of the Bedford Audubon Society. Our bird-friendly backyards program in March generated so many questions about what to plant for birds that we invited Mathew to come here and go into detail on gardening with native plants to provide the resources and habitat that birds require. This program is sponsored by the Lewisboro, Pound Ridge, and Ruth Keeler Memorial Libraries. I'm Liz Gabriel, representing the Lewisboro Library. A quick note for those who are interested in birding walks, we are co-sponsoring a birding nature walk with the Lewisboro Land Trust and the Bedford Audubon on Saturday, June 11th. Details can be found on our website. Welcome, Mathew.
Hello. So just to follow up on that marvelous introduction, my name is Mathew McDowell. I am a naturalist, horticulturist, and garden designer who focuses on Eastern North American native plant communities. And I say community because that's a pretty key part of what we're going to be trying to get at and what we really have to be thinking about when we're thinking about planting for birds. So I'm just going to share my screen. So planting for birds, or thinking about habitat at home. So to begin, habitat and resources. So what birds require. I'm going to be focusing more on concepts than individual plants. I'm going to list a few things, but mostly I just sort of want to communicate what are the kinds of things we should be thinking about and looking for. And then in the follow-up, during the Q&A, we can talk a little bit more about specifics. So planting for birds, I work with an Audubon Society. Why are we concerned? Why do they have a garden? Why do they have a position of garden director? Well, the things you plant have a really major impact on bird life. And by extension, really the environmental communities here writ large. In order to survive, especially at the population level, healthy bird populations require three things. Pretty straightforward. They need food to eat, they need shelter to live in, and they need to be able to make raise baby birds, because if they cannot do that successfully, you're going to run out of birds. Now, bird feeders are a lot of fun. It's probably going to sound like I hate bird feeders and I scorn bird feeders, but I do love them. For many of us, they are our gateway. There's how we start to sort of think about and interact with our local avifauna. And bird feeders are a really fantastic way to sort of bring things in for observations, but they have their limits. They only provide food. They're not providing any of those other things that birds require. And they're only doing that for a limited array of species. Not all birds eat seed. A lot of them have different kinds of diets, or seed is not the sole part of their diet. So why should we think about planting for birds beyond just sort of putting up a bird feeder or nest box or that sort of thing? Well, first of all, to be frank, things are bad and they are getting worse. So going off of some of the research National Audubon has been doing with their climate watch, we found that up to two-thirds of North American birds are vulnerable to extinction due to climate change, as well as other environmental disruptions and that sort of thing. The advantage, if you're providing plants and planting for birds, is that you're providing multiple ecosystem services. So, you're not just giving something that birds will like, you are also providing habitat for other kinds of life. You are providing carbon sequestration. You're feeding pollinators. Well thought out plantings build resiliency. They don't just sort of feed birds, but you are actually supporting the environment writ large. And on top of that, they look nice. I would much rather look at plants than concrete. And on top of all that, it's fun, to quote a person many of you are probably familiar with and who I will be discussing a lot, entomologist Douglas Tallamy. He's a foundational figure in the native plant movement. His book is called Bringing Nature Home, and there's a lot to be said for that. You can view sort of natural foraging behaviors. You can see birds feeding the way they would be out in the wild right from your window. The other thing too is that forage resources provide a measure of social distancing. Think about the global pandemic that we are still in the midst of. Bird feeders have been found to be linked to the spread of disease in certain bird species. Basically, when you have a bird feeder, things are getting packed in, they're being concentrated in spaces closer than they generally would be. And so you tend to get more disease transmission. This is also why bird feeder hygiene is really important. You want to keep your bird feeders clean. And last year, for example, we had a mystery outbreak, and National Audubon was advising everybody during the summer to take their bird feeders down, because the concern, until they could kind of figure out what was killing the birds, was that it's possible it was an infection vector. Again, not saying get rid of your bird feeder, but think of your bird feeder as more of a supplement. It's not giving what the birds need year round. It's helping out a little bit. It's helping you mostly because you can get to observe them easier, but it's not providing all of these other resources. And during situations like with these potential disease outbreaks, things like that, there's something we want to be moving away from. So plants are the way to go, right? They are really the natural way. They are the foundation of the ecosystem. And particular is we really want to focus on the native plants. Organisms, our plants, our birds, our insects, all of these things form communities over thousands of years. And what this means is that the plants that have co-evolved with local birds are in most cases better able to support them. And plants really feed birds directly via fruit and seeds, and they feed birds indirectly through the broader food web. The big one that we are not talking about enough, but which is really crucial to all of this, are insects. What I do with our gardens at Bedford Audubon, what I try to do in my professional practice, basically, I tell people I don't garden for birds. I garden for insects, because if you're gardening for insects, then you're gardening for everything. A looming environmental crisis on top of all of the other environmental crises that we are experiencing is that insect populations are declining dramatically. In many places, insect populations have just crashed. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I've noticed this from year to year. Less and less bugs. Entomologists use sort of as a yardstick for this sort of thing, the window test. How many insects are slamming into your windshield when you're driving around at night? I remember being a kid and that windshield would be caked. Now, forget about it. You don't see anything. That's very, very scary. Major contributing factors to insect declines are pesticide usage. That's obviously the biggest one, and it should really go without saying. If you're trying to have any kind of garden for wildlife, do not be using pesticides. Don't be using herbicides. Don't be dumping poison on the things you're trying to support. Light pollution is another factor with insect declines, but the problems are also dietary. Most herbivorous insects, I should stress, can only feed on a limited number of plants they've evolved alongside. When those plants disappear, the insects follow. And so invasive ornamental landscaping are creating sort of green deserts. These are landscapes that, maybe they look lush, they look full, but when you actually kind of peer beneath the surface, they are lacking the insect life that keeps the whole ecosystem in motion. This, for a lot of people, is their gateway to sort of gardening with native plants. Monarchs. Monarchs are a classic example of this, charismatic, beautiful butterflies. They undergo these incredible migrations back and forth from here to Mexico. And we know they're dependent upon milkweed. And when milkweed populations declined, that's one of the things that made monarchs populations crash as well. And so a lot of people, the way they get their start with sort of gardening native is by these sort of monarch way stations, planting milkweeds for monarchs. This is a fantastic gateway, but we also have to think a little broader. It's not just monarchs that are struggling. But monarchs are significant in that they are a lepidopteran. They have caterpillars. So lepidopteran is just the term for butterflies, moths, and skippers, that group of insect. Caterpillars are amongst the best food sources for birds, especially baby birds. But caterpillars tend to be pretty restricted. So we have to look into these host plants, and this is a really big deal. Work by entomologist Douglas Tallamy, again, and his students estimates that to raise one nest of chickadees to adulthood requires 4,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. Chickadees are not large birds, tiny little birds. And of course, we're all very familiar with chickadees because those are some of the first things to show up at bird feeders. They love bird feeders. They're very charismatic. They're often fearless, bopping around people. This is a bird species that will happily eat seed, but you can have all the bird feeders in the world. If you do not have the plants that are going to be able to feed those 4,000 to 9,000 caterpillars, those chickadees are not going to be able to raise their young, and you're going to run out of chickadees. Solution, this is what I use as the foundation before I really start any gardening project. Tallamy and his students with the National Wildlife Federation have a searchable database that lists native plants and the caterpillars they support by zip code. So if you go to nwf.org native plant finder, you input your zip code, it will give you a list of all the plants and all their caterpillars. Really important. And so whenever I'm starting to think about a garden, I start to think, what are some of these value species that I could incorporate that are going to feed a lot of different caterpillars, because that's how I know I'm going to feed a lot of different birds. Most of the plants on that list have non-native species, but the natives are still important. Just because a caterpillar can eat a North American maple, it doesn't necessarily follow that it can eat a European maple. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. And it's not always predictable that these things are going to line up in that way. So what do I see when I go to the native plant finder and I look up Westchester? Well, here's some woody plants with high host value. Oaks, quercus, 521 different kinds of caterpillar documented from Westchester County. Prunus, cherries, 455. Salix, willows, 431. Betula, birch, 410. But again, it's important. Cherries support 455 species. A native black cherry is a fantastic plant for feeding birds because it's not only feeding all those caterpillars, it's also producing cherries. And we're going to talk about fruit in a little bit. A non-native ornamental cherry, it's not doing those same things. It's not feeding caterpillars. It's not feeding birds in the same capacity. Woody plants in general tend to accommodate more caterpillar species than herbaceous plants. And a lot of this includes great landscaping plants like blueberries with about 295 species of caterpillar, service berries, over 100, Unfortunately, big trees are more difficult to look into landscaping. But as you start to dig into these lists, you can find things that are really suitable. And when you are planting something like this, that you are feeding hundreds of birds and thousands upon thousands of caterpillars. Herbaceous plants. These are the kinds of plants that we're working more with in gardens, right? These are, your perennials, your flower beds. Well, a lot of these have high host value too. Goldenrod support the most at 138. Strawberry, native strawberries, 84 species. Again, really multi-value. You've got flowers, which are good for pollinators. You've got the plants themselves, which are feeding all these caterpillars. And then you've got the strawberries, which are also feeding birds. Helianthus, sunflower, 70 species. Eutrochium and Eupatorium, the Joe Pye weeds and bone sets, 35 species. Most of these native garden perennials have at least some host value, as do native plants that we really commonly regard as weeds like violets or fleabane. Violets support 31 species of caterpillar. Fritillary butterflies will only use violets in this region to lay their eggs. You do not have violets, you don't have those fritillary butterflies. And some fritillary butterfly species are declining and even being wiped out in locations because of loss of violets. Fleabanes are one of those perfect example of a free plant that a lot of people rip out without a thought, but that are providing tons and tons of value for wildlife. You know, just stepping out of the way a little bit, making space for these things is immediately something you can do that is making your home more habitable. So that is also kind of an important thing to know. You know, I'm talking about caterpillars, I'm talking about insects feeding on plants. So often, and so much of what gets us into trouble is that, you know, we see a hole in a leaf or we see a funny spot on something and we immediately jump to the nuclear option. You know, we rush for the poison, start dumping it on everything. We have to move away from that, because the reality is, you know, if you have a garden where nothing is being eaten, you do not have an ecosystem. You know, it's going back to that green desert. You know, nothing's being eaten. It might look lush, but you are not providing an ecosystem. You're not providing habitat. Herbaceous host plants like this can also provide resources in some more surprising ways. So I talked about the importance of insects. You know, we mostly think of insects as being around in spring and summer, but a lot of our birds, you know, they're dependent upon insects year round. So where are they going to? In part, they're going to structures like this. This is a photograph of a goldenrod gall. This variety was developed by a midge. This kind of goldenrod gall here was produced by a species of wasp. Galls are formed when insects lay their eggs into plant tissue, and the plant responds by essentially developing a tumor around the egg and the larvae, and then the plant, the insect larvae feeds upon the tumor and uses that as a sheltered place to grow, and eventually they will emerge next year. Well, these fly larvae are overwintering these galls in the goldenrods. What do you think might have happened here? This is a goldenrod gall that was tucked into by a woodpecker. Woodpeckers seek out these goldenrod galls in the winter because that has been an available source of protein for them. And other birds are aware of this as well. Other birds, like different chickadees, titmice, sparrows, will actually follow the woodpeckers around. And after the woodpecker opened up the galls, they'll check them out to see if there's anything left over. That's why it's really important to leave up your plants, because that's where the food is. Not just the insects that are next year's generation, but also the seeds. You know, plants are setting seed that time of year. These are natural bird feeders. So native aster family plants like sunflowers, asters, coneflowers, blazing stars, goldenrods, black-eyed Susans, Joe Pye, you know, bean family plants like false indigo, clover, senna, partridge pea, some of the native mints like bee balm or agape, the native bunch grasses. I mean, these are great sources of birdseed that you didn't have to pay for. I do not do fall cleanup in the Audubon garden. I don't do it at home either, because that's where the insects are, that's where the seeds are, and that's where the birds are going. They're going to where the life is. You know, we see what looks like messes of decaying vegetation, and you know, homeowners associations throw a fit over that. But we have to kind of reshift our paradigm, because that actually is the habitat. You know, if we want to see the birds, these are the things that we have to be providing, because this is what's feeding them and this is what's supporting them. And that's a really easy mechanism to go about it, right? Just be lazy. You know, this is planting for birds, but sometimes less maintenance is actually more beneficial. So I covered the insects. Another interesting thing, of course, is a lot of birds are fruit eaters, either primarily or they are at least supplementing their diet with fruit, especially a lot of our songbirds. Not all fruit is created equal. Native plants have co-evolved with native birds, and consequently they've adapted to provide the kind of nutrition that's going to get the most noticed and most eaten at the times of year that birds need it most. And so there's a real seasonality to this. that when you actually look at what's right and when, it really matches up with bird behavior. So let's think about what's happening in late spring and summer. This is a lot of the fruit that we really like to eat. Service berries, blueberries, strawberries, the native blackberries and raspberries, huckleberries, native cherries and plums, the red mulberry, native grapes, black elderberry, pokeweed. These are things that are available late spring and summer. These are the things we really like to eat. And these are a lot of fruits that birds really like to eat as well because they're packed with sugar. You think about what birds are doing late spring and summer, they are raising chicks. They are taking care of fledglings. They are mostly eating insects. Their diets are mostly protein. And so that sugar kind of rounds things out. It's also a nice little energy boost for overworked parental birds. It's great for those, big teenage birds that have left the nest and, need that good food supply. And this is what the plants are providing that time of year. That's what the birds are looking for. That's what the plants are providing because that's what's going to be eaten the most. Once we start to leave sort of summer behind and move into kind of late summer, fall, we see fruit with different composition, different nutritional composition ripening. It's this time of year we see things like native viburnum, spicebush, sassafras, native dogwoods, Virginia creeper, poison ivy. Poison ivy is a big one. A lot of people don't know about this. Red cedar, black tupelo. These are plants that have a lot of really high fat content to the fruit. So if you think about, what are birds doing late summer and fall? Well, if they're sticking around, they've got to fatten up for the winter. But if they're migrating, they need good, rich foods. How else is a tiny little warbler going to fly from here to northern South America unless it's seriously, seriously calorie loading? So a lot of these plants have fat content much, much higher than the things that are ripening more in the summer. So a lot of the native viburnums can be 20, 30, 40% fat. Virginia creeper, about 25. Dogwoods, about 25, 35% fat. Poison ivy and spicebush, 50% fat content. These are actually the richest native fruits that we have, and they are coveted by birds. Spicebush is one of those plants that is a dioecious species, which means that spicebush is either female or male, which is very weird for a plant. The overwhelming majority of plants are all both. Spicebush does things a little differently. Only female plants of spicebush produce. I've had many people tell me that they have never seen a female spicebush. I guarantee this is not true. It's a very common plant in our area, but with spicebush, those 50% fat berries, spicebush is actually a relative of avocado, those get gobbled up like that. People don't notice female plants because the fruits get eaten quicker than they can pay attention to them. In contrast to that, when you look at a lot of our invasive species like burning bush, which is a ubiquitous one in Westchester, you'll find that a lot of the fruits on those stick around. There is a phenomenon with burning bush in particular that is called shadow seedlings. If you cut down a big mature burning bush, once that's cut down, you are going to get thousands upon thousands of baby burning bush sprouting underneath it. This is because even though it's fruit that's available same time of year as the spice bush, birds don't want to eat it because it doesn't have that fat content. It doesn't have that right kind of nutritional content. So what ends up happening is that all of those fruits just fall off the mother plant and germinate directly beneath it. And then when you cut the mother plant down, they have access to sunlight and they all start sprouting at once. You will never see that happen with a spice bush because the fruits are just eaten too quickly. They're moved away from the parent plant. And this is what the plant wants. It's trying to spread its seeds around. Because spice bush has evolved with our native birds, it's evolved to provide the kinds of things that those birds are looking for at that time of year. Burning bush evolved in a different part of the world with different birds, so it's doing different things. What ends up happening with a lot of these degraded habitats that we have in Westchester is that a lot of these plants with these real fatty fruits are being eliminated, and they are sort of being supplanted by non-native species that are not providing the same kind of nutrition. So you might look and see a bunch of fruit and think, well, this is fine, but it's not necessarily, because you're not necessarily providing the right kinds of things. At the same time that these fatty fruits are ripening in late summer and autumn, you're also getting plants that are ripening their fruit at the same time, but doing something very differently. They're doing something more akin to what the burning bush is doing. And these are the persistent fruits. These are things like berry, native holly, native roses, the native sumacs, hawthorns, American persimmon, red cedar. These are plants that have fruit with a very, very low fat content. They're no fat, often not a lot of sugar either, though if they do have sugar, it tends to be sort of locked up. Mostly these plants are providing complex carbohydrates. Doesn't necessarily mean they're not nutritious. Chokeberry, rose hips, people talk about those as being sort of superfoods. For the most part, though, these are not things that birds particularly want to eat. They don't taste that good. But because they're low in fat and sugar and high in complex carbohydrates, they stay edible all winter. Birds might not necessarily want to eat these things, but they're there as a fallback if they have nothing else available. And I think what we're seeing is that birds are altering their habits in response to climate change. It's very likely that offering these winter persistent fruits is going to grow in importance. So, birds are sticking around. They're leaving at weird times. They're behaving in ways that they never really have before, as are insects, as are plants. Access to persistent resources like these persistent fruits, I think, is going to become more and more important. So this is what I try to do if I'm sort of thinking about a bird hedge. It's kind of, well, do I have sugary fruits? I have fatty fruits. Do I have persistent fruits? You want to think about having a balance of these things because they're all important, but they're all sort of offering food at different times. Some birds also have dietary preferences. So waxwings, beautiful birds, never go to bird feeders. They only eat fruit and insects. So if you want to see waxwings, you have to have these fruit-eating plants because that's the bulk of their diet. They have really sweet beaks. They go wild for sugary fruit. Catbirds prefer the fatty fruits like dogwood and viburnum. Whereas robins, robins have more sensitive stomachs. They don't eat the fatty fruits as well. So robins actually prefer the stuff like holly and hawthorn that's very lean and carb heavy, as opposed to some of this other stuff. So there's also individual preferences. Robins, a lot of people think of robins as being migratory. Many of them are not. Most of our robins actually stick around here year round. They just alter their habits. So during the spring and summer, they're more open field birds. In the winter, they move into the forests and they switch their diets from being mostly insects to being mostly fruit. Resources that I use to consult, what kind of birds are going to what. Illinois Wildflowers, it provides great lists of birds documented feeding on different plants. Consult that often. And also, similar to the National Wildlife Federation plant finder, Audubon has a plant finder as well, where if you input your zip code, it will tell you what plants are native to your area and what they feed, what kind of birds are attracted to those plants. So nesting habit. I was talking a little bit about food. Well, again, you need those caterpillars to make baby birds, but you also have to have the right kind of nesting habitat. Research is indicating that most of our songbirds, when given the option, preferentially select native plants to build their nests in. This, again, goes back to the insects. They would rather, a chickadee would rather have its nest in an oak that's going to be covered in caterpillars than have its nest in a Norway maple, which is going to have nothing on it. Because that means when the chickadees are foraging to feed the young, they don't have to go as far. They don't want to have to make all those trips. It's stressful. So given the option, birds will almost always select the native plants because those are providing more food for them. There are some exceptions to this. Mockingbirds, I think, are a really interesting one. Mockingbirds used to be very rare in our area, rare to absent in our area. Multiflora rose, which is a horrible invasive species everywhere in Westchester, used to be intentionally planted by Audubon as a hedge roadside plant for birds. We now know this is a very, very bad idea. But apparently mockingbirds love it because mockingbirds have been able to shift their range based on human alteration of the habitat, and they really like multiflora rose. Other than mockingbirds and Lyme's disease, though, multiflora rose, not so great for anything else. So this is why I really want to emphasize these native plants, because that's where they want to nest. Many birds are tree nesters. They depend on mature trees of the right size. Tree holes in particular are vital for cavity nesting birds. A lot of tree holes are formed by woodpeckers. Most woodpecker species do not like to reuse the same tree hole year after year. So in the new year, they will either make a new one or they'll find a new one. In the process, they leave behind a lot of these empty cavities that other birds can move into. The problem in our residential areas is that the plants that are the trees that are providing all these cavities are generally, old mature trees with a lot of heart rot, which is, easy to excavate into. Old mature trees with a lot of heart rot are also the ones that are usually taken down because people are concerned about property damage. If you can leave up these big mature trees, always do it. I mean, truly, that in and of itself is going to provide so much nesting habitat. It's a tree that's, once you've cut down a large tree like that, you're not getting another large tree for another 30, 40, 80 years. This is a pretty finite resource. Happily, many of the cavity nesters will use nest box or other human-made structures. So where you can leave these big mature trees, absolutely do it. This is one area, though, where we can kind of step in and compensate for some of the loss of those trees with things like nest boxes. But, nest boxes are not providing other resources. An actual tree is not only sequestering carbon, filtering the air, it's providing food for a lot more things. It's providing habitat and structure for a lot more things. And we should be looking at things like nest boxes and bird feeders, as fun as they are, and I'm a big fan of both of them. And we should be looking at these things as more supplemental. We should really be trying to building from the ground up, literally, with plants. So trees can be difficult for us to accommodate, but a lot of birds have other nesting habitats. Many of them are shrub nesters. And so shrub hedges provide not just food, but nesting grounds for many bird species. Cardinals, catbirds, goldfinches, as well as many sparrow, bunting, flycatcher, and warbler species prefer to construct their nests in dense shrub tangles. This is a cardinal that is actually nesting in a burning bush, so they will use non-native things, but if they can find those native shrubs, that's certainly preferential because those native shrubs are going to be supporting a lot more of the insects that they have to feed their young with. So if you think about a well-designed bird hedge, 1 to 2 species of summer fruits, 1 to 2 species of fall fruits, 1 to 2 species of winter fruit. You think about designing that well, you're also packing in those things with high host plant value. You've just provided a perfect nursery for baby birds. And you've also just provided feeding ground for witness things like fruit feeders, insect feeders, the things that aren't necessarily going to come to your bird feeder. And this is a pretty straightforward thing to do. I mean, most of us have space to just set up a little hedge like that. And it doesn't have to be huge, you know? Also have ground nesters. A lot of the ground nesting birds, they won't appreciate the amount of disturbance near our home. Some of them will tolerate it, most of them won't. But certainly if we have kind of larger properties, we might conceivably have nesting habitat there. And just in general, by giving them a diverse communities of native herbaceous plants, you can at least provide foraging opportunities. And if the conditions are right, they might make a home. So like a lot of our woodland birds that nest in the ground, like ovenbirds or white-throated sparrows, they require things like this. This is a tangle of bellworts, Christmas fern, Virginia creeper, lots of hiding resources, lots of insects, lots of fruit, things like that. Coverage from things like fern, perennials, brush piles, evergreens, are a big one. These are giving birds a sense of security. They offer hiding places. They're offering somewhere to escape during inclement weather. But it is also important to note that, we want to avoid an ecological trap. Ecological traps are when you're luring birds or any other kind of animal into a situation that is not good for it. If you have an outdoor cat, don't plant for birds. So many of our birds are taken out by cats. Cats kill billions of songbirds every year. If you have a lot of outdoor cats in your neighborhood, the last thing you want to do is come up with these beautiful, well-designed bird plantings and, give Sylvester a smorgasbord. So you do want to be a little careful about that. Certainly also if you are in a situation where lots of pesticides are used, we want to try to avoid that as well. We want to avoid the ecological traps. So just in review, before we get to some questions, you want to think about seasonality. Are you providing things throughout the year? You want to think about diversity. Are you providing different kinds of resources, different kinds of habitat? We don't all have the space to include everything, but something I like to do is to sort of think about gaps. Look around the area around you and see, what's missing. What could I provide and in my home or in a garden setting that maybe the general landscape is not providing? And for many of us that are living in more suburban or urban areas, that's a pretty long list. We can't all accomplish everything, but if we can at least think about providing these oases of habitat, we can at least support this. And finally, just leave room for mess. Birds don't like it super tidy. Very few things do. You want that structure, you want that diversity, because that's what's providing spaces.